Well, welcome back. We are now going to talk a little bit about the new structure for the ISO 9001 2015 revision. There are some considerable changes here. So there are 10 sections total that you have to think about now. Considerable changes to this. The first 3 sections are still the same as always. You've got your scope, your normative references, and your terms and definitions. Yes, of course, there are some changes to each one of those, but they're not substantive in the sense of the overall structure of the new standards. You then have the next sections 4 through 10, which have some considerable changes, and we'll spend some time talking about those today.
Once you get through that context relative to the organization, and by the way, in that particular section, it talks immediately about the mindset of the organization relative to the standard. Then right on the heels of that comes the understanding of how leadership actually becomes a part of the system. In the past, you've had maybe an occasional management review meeting or something like that. Now we're talking about true leadership instead of just management. And that means, of course, that there's going to need to be some very integrated planning considerations. There's going to need to be management support and support for the organization in terms of resources and application. And of course, there's going to need to be some understanding in the greater part. I want to turn it over to Peter on that operational side.
Well, we haven't seen a whole lot of operational items before in ISO 9001, so this is an entirely new section, and it's got a lot of detail in it. You also have some performance evaluation areas in there as well as continual improvement. Some of those are carryovers from the previous standard, but there are also some significant new sections in there as well.
So as we look at those different line items in the QMS structure, we keep in mind now a very important concept for a closed loop orientation to that structure. So the plan, do, check, act orientation we've all known for improvement in the Schuhart cycle is even more so the case for this new structure. And one of the things that I just want to mention here before Peter discusses the latter part of the cycle is that planning function, and just reinforcing my earlier comments about how management now is involved in this process. Mainly because, as we talked about in the intro, that we're talking about getting answers to questions about how do I ride herd on an organization that's going to make my product 3,000 or 4,000 miles away? How do I affect that quality from a planning perspective? And driving objectives, driving responsibilities, driving all of those planning conditions that we've known in the past that have been kind of parochial management things. Now we're talking about leadership and planning and what that does on the front end of this structure as we move into the new section 8, 9, and 10 of the standard.
So if you look at these new sections, under the do of the plan, do, check, act cycle is squarely into the operational aspects of your organization. So within that, there's some significant new sections, and we have actually some additional information on these later on in this presentation, but I'll quickly go through what those are. So you've got operation of planning and control, you've got determination of market needs, you've got operational planning processes, you've got control of external provision of goods and services, you've got development of goods and services, you've got production of goods and services, you've got release of goods and services, and non-conforming goods and services. So what used to be just purely the developmental aspects are now squarely into the entire do cycle of the plan, do, check, act cycle.
Yeah.
So the next section then would be checking, where you have performance and evaluation, an entirely new section where you have monitoring and measuring. Again, a little bit of a carryover from previous.
Section 8, what used to be
exactly.
Section 8.
And then you have internal audits and management review, now specifically spelled out in the check part of the cycle.
I find it interesting, Peter, that you point out management review. We know management review is Section 5, the early Section 5 before the standard even really starts to do anything.
Right.
Now management review finds itself
Right,
in
in
the
check.
in the check section. Yeah.
Exactly. And then finally, under the Act, you have the improvement section, which is, again, an entirely new section. So that's your nonconformities, your corrective plans. And remember now, we don't have preventive action anymore. We just purely have corrective action and then continual improvement, with a healthy dose, by the way, of risk interspersed all the way through all of this.
Risk, all
Right,
the way
exactly.
through. Absolutely.
Okay.
So these first sections that I described, or actually that you described, are pretty typical of a standard, right? You have this. The scope is probably the only thing that's a little different because of the nature of the Plan, Do, Check, Act orientation. But normative references, terms and definitions, we won't see a lot of changes in those things, although we may see some new definitions.
And some updates to the existing definitions, but really there's not much change there.
Yeah.
We get into a little bit more change here when you talk about the context of the organization under Section 4. So there's a section for the context. What is the organization? What are the implications? Who are the interested parties? There's a big emphasis now on interested parties, your users, your customers.
Mm-hmm.
Your scope of the QMS is defined in Section 4, and the quality management system itself is spelled out here. Now remember, we don't have a quality manual anymore, so really applying the standards here, your quality management system is spelled out in the standards, and it's implied that you have all of the elements that are required in this new standard in your quality management system itself,
Yeah.
and that you no longer need a quality manual to define that.
And I think the two elements in the old system that used to collect us, which is objectives and system planning, the 5 4s, those used to be like, what are those? And do we really need to define those? Now, in the scope of the system, those become the centerpiece for planning and objectives for which the system will satisfy those, right? And I think it's interesting that in all of this, in this front end piece, again, risk becomes a consideration as part of those objectives.
Absolutely.
And risk acceptance.
One of the big themes here is risk all the way throughout these. So Section 5 deals with leadership. So it used to be the management section in the past. So now it talks about the generalities of the leadership, who needs to be doing what functions need to be in an organization. It also talks about management commitment. And we've seen an underemphasis on management commitment in the past. Walt and I have spent plenty of time with clients where management was underrepresented. So we need to have I think they felt that there needed to be a robust provision in there for that. There's also a policy section, and then the roles and the responsibility and who has authority within the system.
I think one of the things that Peter and I have found in our travels and working with various different sizes of organizations in complexity, and we've been in living rooms with people who only have 2 people running an organization, and then we've been in organizations where they're basically plastered all over the country, and in some cases all over the globe, that we've had to trot to deal with these organizations. But the one thing that truly I think is an important piece to keep in mind now as we look forward is scalability of the system, so that you can be successful. So that scalability thing, I think, is really important in that risk consideration.
Right. Section 6 is planning, so that's all about the actions to address risks. Again, risk is a key word there, and opportunities. And your objectives and plans to achieve them, and the planning of changes. So it's all about those areas.
I think in Section 7, of course, we're still dealing with that, remember, that plan component before we get into Do, Check, Act. Here what we're doing is really looking hard at the use of resources. We at MasterControl on the consulting side have some really interesting things we're doing in a virtual environment in terms of use of resources. You don't have to be in one place to be a quality unit. You don't have to be in one place to be an engineering unit.
Right.
So resource and resource application and use, as we look at outsourcing and commitments for organizations to work to make you successful, is a big piece of this. And of course, what comes in hand with that is making sure that there are no risks associated with the competency levels for those people who have roles and responsibilities in the organization. Awareness and communication now becomes imperative. Using technology venues for communicating information, MasterControl system is designed to do that. So things that we used to take lightly before, like collaborative efforts, review efforts, approvals, all those things now become centerpiece for this organization. And that's where we land on this new term, documented information. So it's no longer we have a procedure, let's take a look at it, or we have data, let's take a look at it. The new world is, how did you make that decision? How did you solve that problem? How did you effectively implement that plan? And in all three, were there risks, and did you address them?
So section 8 here is now where we go into the do of the cycle, and that's the operational elements. Again, this is a fairly new and substantive section, and there was previously a lot of complaint that there wasn't enough information or enough standard reference to the operational section. So you got it now in spades. If you wanted it before, you've got it. So operational planning and control is a big part of it, of course. And determination of your market needs obviously should be a big piece of that as well. Interaction with your customers. Again, you see the customer focus. Operational planning in your processes by which you do your operational planning. So we see a lot of emphasis on that now.
It's interesting, Peter, in that one, as we all know, in the whole standard, you have that one little line item in note number 3 of the planning section for operations. It says, oh, by the way, look at your risk standard if you get a chance, basically. Now you're going to see that just about every other line item in the standard, especially in this section.
Yep. Control of external provisions in goods and services, also there. So that's all your supplier management systems. Development of goods and services, also related to supplier management, of course. And the production. It took us, 6, 7, 8 different items before we even got to the actual production part of it.
Yeah.
So lots of planning that goes into that prior to it. Release of goods and services, so the testing and the release aspects of it as well, all firmly spelled out within this new standard. And then non-conforming goods and services, what to do with exception handling when things don't conform.
Okay, so once we get a handle on now this, what was Section 7 that had design, had planning, had provisions for production, had non-conformances, had everything right down to calibration of your scale, is now expanded to have all of these things that are considered as part of what you do to make your product. And we're moving from that plan and do now into the check mode. So as we look at Section 9, we have an interesting twist in how this section pulls in what has happened up to this point. So monitoring, measurement, and analysis and evaluation from Section 8 now becomes the driver on the front end of performance evaluation in Section 9. And the validation of processes for internal auditing becomes a focal point of the standard because of risk. Right. So you're looking at the risk of processes that actually may determine your audit schedule, your emphasis, how much you dig into something, all of that being risk-based. And of course, the result of that then is the improvement component, or what we know now as correction as one level, or corrective action as the next level in terms of improvement.
Right. I also think it's kind of interesting that management review is put all the way back into the check and the act part of the standard, as opposed to the front end where it used to be. So I think that's an appropriate place for it.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. It's nice to see that the reorganization of the system has taken that evolution to come to that point where it makes sense to do it there.
I agree.
So we then wrap up then with the act condition, or the plan, do, check, act part of the cycle in Section 10, where the improvement conditions take place. And I might add that while it says improvement, what's really in parentheses behind there also is innovation. So as you look to improve the organization, making decisions, risk-based decisions, and actions and plans should have some innovative intent in them as you try to do things like correct nonconformities or take corrective actions, all of that being improvement oriented.
I also find it interesting that the nonconformity is written several times into different sections. It's into the do, the check, and the act.
Yeah, it is.
So I think that to me means that there's a new emphasis on that area, and that's definitely an area that most organizations need to bolster their current offerings in. Given what we've seen out there in the field, I'd say that's pretty much validated by what we've seen.
Yeah.
So,
Well, now that we've had the chance to kind of enlighten you around the sections of the system and get a little bit into the guts of it, now we're going to get to the heart of this, the matter in section 3 here, and we're going to talk to you about risk. So we'll see you then.